Welcome to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast, where we break down the complex and emotional process of divorce into manageable, easy-to-understand steps. I'm your host, Greer Howard, and with me is Bobby Buchanan, widely recognized as one of Illinois' top divorce attorneys, offering unmatched insight and experience in family law. Well, for today's topic, we are going to be talking about debt during divorce. Now, we've covered assets and that being something that, you separate whenever you're going through a divorce. And today, we're going to be talking about when you have debt and liabilities in the state of Illinois and how that's handled. So how is the court going to fairly decide to split up those debts? And what does that look like? They could be debts from a mortgage, maybe credit card debt, medical debt, tax debt. So I'm here with Bobby. And Bobby, why don't we just kind of start off with maybe what is a misconception when it comes to debt and getting divorced?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that after you file, you don't have to worry about your debt, that, whatever the other side does with their credit card, they're going to have to handle. And, kind of everything is paused, if you will, as far as that marital property aspect. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. But let me tell you, I'd be lying if I said I was excited about this topic. You mentioned all this debt. Debt, I don't know for you, but for me, debt's somewhat of a trigger word. It's not until recently that I was able to feel like, oh my God, I'm not like accumulating more debt. When I was in law school, I pretty much had to live on my credit card, and I was taking on huge student loans and just kind of making it by until I saw in the future when possibly I'd be able to start tackling it. I was just remembering when my wife and I first started dating, and this is after I got licensed as an attorney, but my first job, I think I was getting paid like $40,000 under the table. He'd write me a check every week. It was a 1099. And we'd go on dates, and my wife would pick up the check, and she'd put it on her credit card. Well, fast forward, I think 5 years later, I ended up paying off that credit card. So I was actually paying for it. So you might say, hey, man, we'll pick up the tab for those dates. Well, I did. It was just like a 5-year delay.
Yeah, well, with interest. So that was definitely a lesson learned. You might as well just picked it up at the beginning, or maybe gone on a picnic or cooked at home, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, taking on huge amounts of debt, in school is something we often do or have to do to advance our careers. Credit card debt isn't ideal, but sometimes we're living outside of our means. All of that's got to be dealt with during the divorce process. And it's not my it's not my favorite topic. Just like assets, I don't love the idea of having to figure out how to split assets because it's such a gray area. Like there's nothing just cut and dry about it, even though you think it should be or could be. So
yeah. Well, I agree with you, Bobby. I feel the same way about debt. Any type of debt brings a lot of stress. For me personally, I don't like it. So I try to stay away from it as well. And then the thought of, potentially someone else's debt that you're married to, that just brings a whole nother level. So why don't we kind of start with the state of Illinois? Is it cut and dry? By the way, as you're talking about that, is it cut and dry how they handle debt?
yeah. Well, it's cut and dry. It sounds cut and dry in the sense that just like assets, there's marital debt and there's non-marital debt. And the rules are basically the same. It's debt accrued before the marriage is going to be non-marital debt, and debt accrued after you get married is marital debt. And non-marital debt, you're going to take with you. The judge doesn't even have the power to assign non-marital debt to your spouse. But marital debt, that needs to be divided. And just like assets, we use the equitable distribution method in order to divide those debts. So that framework right there is pretty good. It gets a little bit tricky when we start talking about equitable distribution. What does that look like? Because I feel like, when it comes to debt, we have a lot more emotions, or at least negative emotions tied up with it. And let's be honest, a lot of marriages, that money stress, I'm not a psychologist, but I would imagine money and the stress that comes with it is probably at the top of the list when we're looking at things that have caused a marriage to break down, or at least it's not real fertile ground to be growing a dynamic, powerful marriage when you have massive debt or debt's accumulating, or maybe someone's hiding debt. So just the negativity around debt can make it hard to figure out and negotiate through.
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about reasons for getting divorced, I think you make such a great point. That financial aspect could be one of the top reasons that you do want to get divorced, because you don't feel like your spouse is, acting responsibly, and maybe they are accruing a lot of debt. So, that's even more of a trigger, because you're worried about what, you're potentially going to have to be responsible for, during a divorce. And what I was thinking when you were saying that, actually those meals, I think they might have been non-marital, because that happened before you guys got married. So
hey, there we go. You're on it.
You did a good thing by going ahead and paying that off a little, some extra points there.
I did. And you know what? That's not uncommon when we come into a marriage, is to pay off non-marital debt. Like, we start assuming we this partnership at the beginning, it's we're all on the same team. We're going to work together. We're going to clear up everything from our past and forge ahead together. So when we do end up getting divorced, that kind of, all that stuff comes up, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, I paid off your student loans, and now I have to split your credit card debt from your extravagant, vacations that you wanted to go on with your girlfriends, or your golf trips with your guy friends, or whatever. And it can become really, really emotional.
Yeah. One of the big ones, and we've sort of touched on this before, is the home and potentially your mortgage. And if you go back to some other videos we've done, we've talked about, what makes sense for someone keeping the home and them having their name, the mortgage in their name. But if a spouse does, stay in the house, is that kind of assumed that they take on the quote debt of the mortgage?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, it's going to be the person who stays in the house in 99% of cases needs to take on the mortgage. It just gets way too complicated if they don't. And frankly, I would never advise my client to allow the other side to stay in the house and they stay on the mortgage. Because what happens is, if you're on a mortgage, you might think, well, let me just get this deal done and stay on the mortgage, because they're not able to refinance, and they'll just continue to make the mortgage payments, but I'll be on the mortgage. Well, you can't go out and get another mortgage very easily if you already have one. Like, that is one of the number one things that a bank is going to look at, is how much debt do you already have? What's your debt to income ratio? So getting off of that mortgage is going to be key. So the short answer is yes, the person who takes the house takes the mortgage, but there's a bit more to figure out there logistically. And that's why the house and the mortgage can be one of the sticking points in untangling.
Right. And like I mentioned, we really go into depth about that in another video. So you can definitely check that out. But as we're talking about the mortgage, why don't you talk us through maybe some of the biggest areas that people are dealing with potential debt? So obviously the mortgage, the home is one. What would be some of those other categories?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the mortgage, credit cards, tax liabilities, and medical debt. I think those are the biggest ones. So as far as the mortgage, just to kind of bring this full circle, really what we're looking at is whoever stays in the house. This is assuming, because we always have the easy route, the pragmatic route on one side, which is selling the house. That seems on paper like it's the easiest route, because you pay off the mortgage, you split the proceeds, there's more liquidity, so maybe there's other debts to pay off and you can use the proceeds to do that. Not the best the best route, as we've talked about in other episodes, because it might be better for the kids to stay in a certain school district. Maybe you live across the street from the school. You have a lot of emotions tied up with the house, so not as easy as me just saying sell the house. That's the simple thing to do. So on one side, we have selling the house. On the other side, we have things like cash out refis, which means, okay, I'm going to stay in the house, but we're both on the mortgage. So the only way for you to get the equity that you're entitled to and get off the mortgage is for me to convince the bank that I can carry this mortgage entirely myself on my income. And that's not always a simple thing to do, but it's really, that's the ultimate question. Can the party that wants to live in the house go to the bank and convince the bank, not only am I going to carry this mortgage myself, but I want to pull out $200,000 of equity from this house. So if you're thinking about divorce, you're thinking about the house, and you want to stay there, go to a mortgage broker and have that conversation, figure out what is actually possible.
Yeah. And if you're watching this video in 2025, when we are releasing it, mortgage rates are a big discussion anyways, because if you had bought your home, a few years ago, you might have an interest rate that's really low and the rates are not the same. Now it's much higher. So it could be more expensive for you to stay in that home. So it really is just a deeper conversation that you need to have with your attorney and with, potentially a mortgage lender to kind of figure out, what might be the best case for your scenario.
Great point. Super, super good point. Because if you go to the bank, they are not giving you that 3.25 or 2.9% rate that you got. Like, those were historically low rates. We're probably never going to see those rates again in our lifetime. So you just got to be prepared. Like, you're not only are you going to have to get a new mortgage, but your mortgage payment is going to go up significantly.
Right. Because of the interest, and then also because you're pulling out money. So
yeah,
it's a whole thing. Okay. So let's talk about credit cards, because this is a big one as well. Talk us through kind of credit card debt and how that's handled.
Yeah. So credit card debt accrued before the marriage is non-marital. Credit card debt that you take on during the marriage is going to be marital. So the court has to figure out how to split it. And that's equitable distribution. When I say the court has to figure it out, that's just kind of lawyer talk, because in reality, you two need to figure it out. It really does not make sense to litigate any of this stuff to say, well, I just want the judge to figure it out. You're at the dinner table, you're talking to your spouse saying, well, we need to figure this out. We've decided that our marriage is at an end, and then we need to figure this stuff out. I talked to Bobby's office. He said, try to do it without lawyers, get as far along in the process as you can. And then you go, well, I just want the judge to figure it out. Well, it doesn't work like that. If you want the judge to figure it out, you're going to be looking at a year plus in the process and probably at least 10 to 15, if not more, grand in attorney's fees. Yeah. So we got to figure out how to work out the credit card debt situation. With all those negative emotions, it can be tough.
Yeah. And, I think we've got to dig a little bit deeper into the credit card, scenario anyway, because a lot of times, okay, one, you may not agree on all the purchases. Like, sometimes I think that, people can tend to put things on credit cards that maybe both spouses don't want to pay for, because it's more of a something for themselves. You could open a credit card in just your name, right? And so, like, potentially maybe your spouse doesn't even know that you have that credit card. So what are some of those scenarios, and kind of how does some of those things play out?
Yeah, well, we have to realize, because, if you're watching this, you're obviously divorce is on your radar. And I don't know if it's going to be next week that you pick up the phone and decide that you need to file your divorce documents and really get it started, or in 2 or 3 years. But what we need to realize is that while we're married, pretty much everything that's put on that credit card, we're going to have to take on as our share of the debt. Now, the one exception is something called dissipation, and that's the misuse of funds from a marriage. So if your spouse is using a credit card during the marriage to pay for lavish vacations with their mistress, or gifts, or, they're paying rent, or gambling, or substance abuse, those things could be classified as dissipation, and you might not have to pay for them. but there are very strict rules on that. I wouldn't bank on that. And when it comes to something like substance abuse or gambling, if you have known your spouse is doing this for years and it's just kind of part of the marriage, part of their personality, you might not get the benefit of dissipation for those things. So you just have to realize that while you're married to someone, their bad money habits are your bad money habits, and you're going to have to pay the price when you get divorced. So it's tough. You have to have, no one likes to talk about money in their marriage. Like, I've never, of all my friends and my family and clients that I've talked about this stuff with, like, nobody is excited to talk about it. You always have to carve out separate time. My wife and I for a while had a good pattern where we were talking about like making something on the calendar, like once a month, like let's talk about finances, let's go over the credit card and that sort of thing. But it's so easy to push aside and not do. So it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. You were sort of talking about that person who is potentially, thinking about getting divorced. Are there any things they should like be doing to maybe be able to protect themselves from anything? I mean, like because you're mentioning, well, if you knew about the gambling habit or you knew about the substance abuse, is there anything you can do, or basically because you're staying married and you know that they're doing these things, you will be liable?
Well, you can't. I mean, if we had a magic wand and we could stop our spouse from making these purchases or spending this money that we think isn't wise, then we take our magic wand and we do that. Short of the magic wand, if we can talk to them and have these conversations and maybe get on the same page, like that's something. Short of that, not a whole lot. I mean, like, you need to be aware of it and maybe not turn a blind eye. I think what happens sometimes is when we do start to wake up to what's going on financially on the other side, if we're ready to take off our rose-colored glasses, we're going to start to see a lot more about what's going on. And it's going to elevate our concern probably to a level where we go, I need to face this right now. This either needs to stop. We need to address it. This is a moment of reckoning in our marriage. Or if you don't think it's worth going that route, maybe accelerating your own personal timeline for filing for divorce. Because really that filing date, while it doesn't change the equation, credit card debt that your spouse takes on after you file for divorce and the process is pending is still marital, but it may change the equation as far as what equitable distribution is. So a judge, if it does go that route, might say, wait a minute, you guys separated or you filed for divorce, and then the other side racked up the credit card debt for 50 grand on, this stuff that clearly wasn't related to living expenses. I could see and have seen a judge put all of that debt on that person, but that's not a black and white rule.
Yeah. That makes sense. And, another thing it makes me think about, is it helpful at all if you are trying to fight for your marriage? Like you're thinking, okay, this is a really big problem and I potentially need to file and move along with separating from my spouse. But there's also people who are probably, their spouse has a gambling problem or whatever, but they're like, I really want to make it work. Could you potentially like go see a counselor who has like written notes about that you have expressed concern, or send an email of like, hey, I'm really concerned about these expenses, so that later you could show a judge, like maybe just to be sort of helpful to back up that you weren't supporting those habits?
I like your thinking. You're thinking like a creative lawyer.
Yeah.
I love it. I would say, good thinking, but what it says almost equally. If I'm the attorney representing the gambler, I'm going to say, listen, Greer knew about this. Like, he was even part of it. She was emailing the counselor. She was trying to get, like, this was part of our marriage. This was just what we were dealing with. But again, this is why I don't love this topic, because I can't tell you definitively, Greer, which way that's going to go. Yeah. So if we're if we're in the place in our marriage where we're kind of strategizing what we need to say or do in order to plan for divorce down the road, that's really tricky. And it's hard to get any really return on that sort of those choices. Another option, and this one will work, and it's very pragmatic, is a postnuptial agreement. If you're in the space of your marriage where spending is out of control and it's really affecting your own relationship, you feel like trust is being lost and you don't know how to continue things, then as you look to maybe save your marriage and go to counseling and you have these tough talks with your spouse, one of the things you might look into doing is create a postnup, which is an agreement, a written agreement that you're saying, okay, all of the debt, all the credit card debt that we've accrued, here's how we're going to split it if we get divorced. And going forward, any debt that you take on your credit cards is going to be yours, and any debt I take on my credit cards is going to be mine. And we agree we're not going to have any joint credit cards. Like whatever you want your agreement to be, put it into a written agreement. That can actually create a great framework for not only talking about divorce, talking about your marriage, talking about your finances, but giving clarity to both sides. So maybe you can fix some of these trust issues and fix some of these financial issues that you guys are having.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I at least that's something you could do. I imagine that's an awkward conversation, but
Well,
to
be honest, we're having a lot of awkward conversations right now in our marriages if we are thinking about divorce, and there's not going to be easy conversations here.
Yeah. And I even like that idea if you are headed for divorce, but maybe the divorce, you are kind of gathering that it's not going to be quick. I kind of like that idea too, because then you're already establishing, okay, we're agreeing that whatever we put on our cards from this day forward, we're going to take care of ourselves. Yeah. And, as we're talking about all this money, by the way, Bobby, what type of figure is really worth fighting for? Because you also are going to be paying attorney's fees.
Yeah. I mean, I think ballpark, anything less than 5 figures is definitely not worth litigating over, because attorney's fees just go up so quickly once you start to litigate. And what we mean by litigate is we're going into court and we're asking for a trial, basically. And in order to get to a trial, there has to be this comprehensive exchange of financial information, financial documents, financial affidavits. There has to be many court dates advising the judge of where we're at in the process. Maybe there's settlement conferences that the judge orders. Then there's what's called a pretrial conference where the judge tries to weigh in and give recommendations. And then finally, there's a trial. All of that is just so time-consuming, expensive, and stressful. There's no way it makes sense to do any of it if you're not fighting over like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 at least. Otherwise, you're better off negotiating the best you can and just getting through the process and getting on to your next chapter.
Yeah, I think that's a really good rule of thumb. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. You sort of mentioned that you could do this post agreement that you legally agree that, hey, from this date forward, we're going to each take on our own credit card debt. But I want to circle back to that just for a minute, because if you don't do that, can the couple assume that if you filed for separation and you're separated from that point on, is it your own debt? Or like you're sort of alluding to, you still are both responsible no matter who's spending it?
Yeah, I think you should. The short answer is no, it's not your own debt after you file. It's still marital debt. I mean, that's what the law says. And you should assume that that's going to be the case. Again, equitable distribution allows some flexibility in there as far as what a judge could do or what the law says should be done. But what we have to keep in mind is that if our spouse decides to take that sort of action, we could still be on the hook. And knowing that, we want to keep this whole thing as controlled as possible. That's why you don't want to do things to poke the bear in your divorce process. That's why you want to try to be as diplomatic and kind and strategic as you can in the divorce process. That's why you don't want to serve your spouse at work or, put things on social media and make things public and really, again, poke the bear to make them angry or whatever the case may be, because you don't know what's going to happen and you might be left holding the bag for some of that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's move on to another area that potentially could have some debt, and that is taxes.
Yeah.
Talk us through, what you are responsible for, and because I think some couples, unfortunately, they may not even really know what's going on with taxes. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, taxes is, again, one of those things like credit card debt that there could be a lot of negative emotions around it. And I think taxes, more than any other debt area, there's surprise in the divorce process because there's all this transparency that happens once you do get divorced or you're going through the process. Like, the attorneys are gonna want to know and see the tax returns for the last couple years at least, and if we suspect there's something else fishing going on the past few years, like, there's going to be a magnifying glass. And what I see is spouses being shocked that those tax returns that they were signing never got filed, because maybe where there wasn't money to pay the tax liability or something else was going on. So there can be a lot of shock there, as far as what the tax situation is.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different, couples going through divorce, and it's really sad sometimes when you don't fully understand what's happening in your financial situation. And so I just always want to encourage people to make sure that you're having those conversations with your spouse. You understand about your credit card debt, you understand about what you're saving, your retirement, your taxes. And this is just such a great example of, you don't want to just assume that your spouse is doing the things that they're supposed to be doing financially, including filing your taxes.
Yeah. And I think it's such a great reminder and such great advice. And I know that, even in my marriage, I'm the one who's responsible for preparing the taxes, and at every, whatever it is, March or April, whenever we get the taxes done, my wife gets an email, I think, just basically asking her for the e-authorization to sign. I don't even know if she sees the figures, which, would I have any issue with her looking at it? No. And so I think what you're talking about is, like, get curious, and it never hurts a second pair of eyes. Like, I wouldn't mind if she was more engaged in the tax situation. Like, it never hurts to have a second pair of eyes, asking questions, looking at things, understanding the financial picture. The more curious and engaged I think we both can be in a marriage about our finances, the healthier it is. But easier said than done.
Yeah, absolutely. A subject like taxes seems real boring, when everything's going well, but trust me, it's going to become very important if it's not going well.
Yeah. So on that note, let's talk about what happens in those divorces, because I think I kind of left a little cliffhanger there of, we find out during the divorce process that our spouse hasn't filed taxes for 3 or 4 years, and we have a $50,000 tax liability with the IRS. Well, that's not on me, right? I mean, I didn't know the taxes weren't being filed. Well, I'm sorry, but it probably is. Like, you're still going to have to split that debt in most scenarios, unless there is some sort of, maybe fraud associated with it, in which case, even if in the divorce process, the judge allocates it to both of you, there's also something called innocent spouse relief, which you can talk to a tax attorney about. And if there was some sort of fraud or underreporting or some aspect like that, you might be able to get off the hook. So in certain situations, you can get off the hook, but if it's just like they didn't want to file because they didn't want to pay, well, that's both of your problem when you get divorced.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So make sure you're having those tough conversations. Another area, Bobby, that I want to talk about is medical debt. So
Yep.
let's discuss if you have medical debt, if, it could be both people, it could be one. How is that divided?
Yeah, medical debt is generally going to be, I mean, one, if you take it on during the marriage, it's marital debt. So we know it has to be split in some way or another. Most of it is going to be split 50-50 or some close approximation to that based on incomes of the parties and how other assets are split. But there are situations where maybe certain medical procedures might not be split 50-50 if it's maybe a cosmetic procedure or something like that where I didn't even, I wasn't even on board with it and my spouse went ahead and did it. We weren't in the position to even really afford it. It was put onto a credit card or it was done after filing. Maybe someone files for divorce and the other person says, well, now's the time to enhance my look, and they go and get some sort of procedure. So I could see in that instance a judge saying, yeah, we're not going to put that on the person who had no knowledge of it and it happened after separation. But again, no easy answers here, and it's unpredictable. So we want to be really careful about how we control the situation and make sure it doesn't get out of control.
Yeah, and I'm glad you clarified that because the medical can really be a broad term. I feel like these days because it's one thing if you're talking about someone who's gone to an emergency room and had something with their health that was very serious and they need to take care of, versus something that was cosmetic, that you're mentioning that can sort of fall under that medical, but it was an elected surgery, some type of elected thing, that's really important to think about. And, you kind of mentioned it, but so once the separation happens, is it the same as credit cards? I mean, assuming it's all the same, let's say it's not a cosmetic thing, it's a true medical emergency that you have. It is, if you've separated but that happens, something happens, is that typically split 50-50 even though you're separated?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say usually it is, even though you're separated. Now, if you've been separated for 5, 10, 20 years, then a judge might look at it differently. But if we're talking about separation in the course of the divorce process, it's still marital debt. And that's why it's not easy to say one way or another what's going to happen, because it is marital debt, but the judge has the equitable distribution framework to look through. So most of the times, if it's something that's happened that is just, you would have taken it on if you'd been together, but you're separated just because of the divorce process, you're probably still going to have to split that. But if it's high enough, if it's a $50,000 medical debt, it might be worth litigating over. It might be if your attorney says, you know what, because of these particular circumstances here, because of the judge we have, because of what the latest case law is on this situation, we might convince a judge that all of this debt should go to the other side. Then you have to make the decision on whether or not you want to do that. But for a lot of people, and myself included, I'd rather just say, you know what, I want to just resolve this. So I'm going to do the thing that's fair or even a little unfair to myself, because it's so important to get through this process. So I'm going to be, how can I say this? I'm maybe going to take on a little bit more of this than I really need to or should, because I value getting through this process quicker.
Yeah. I mean, throughout this whole conversation, Bobby, it just really makes me, think about, and it reiterates that the longer you take through the divorce process to to get to an agreement, the more expensive it can be. In the past, we've really discussed the expense when really on the attorney fees side and how that can really add up. But the other part of that equation is now you're also talking about, based off our conversation today, you're talking about, credit card debt that can, accumulate, tax debt that can accumulate, medical debt that can accumulate. So all of these things can be happening during that time. So I feel like it would be even more of a motivation to go ahead and wrap this up and decide how we want to split ways, because then you're not worried about some of these factors of what might happen financially between when you separate and when you actually get divorced.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a dog in this fight. If people, obviously everyone's life is different, and whether or not you stay married or you get divorced, that's a very personal decision. But what I think we are getting at here is make a decision. And if you're going to make the decision of, I want to save my marriage, then address the financial issues head on, because you can't play ignorant during the divorce process and say, well, I didn't really know about that, or that was all them spending, or, they were in charge of doing the taxes. Most of that stuff isn't going to fly. And that financial situation that you kind of ignored for all of those years, you're going to be left having to pay for at least half of it. I would assume that as you think through this to help you make your decision.
Wow. Okay. So Bobby, today, what would be kind of the big takeaways when you're potentially going through a divorce and debt is a part of it?
I think it's ultimately the emotional aspect. Don't poke the bear. See what you can control. And like I just said, you need to face the music. If your debt situation is out of control, if you feel like there's spending going on that you're not approving, that you're not comfortable with, you need to address it one way or the other. Because if you don't, that problem is just going to get bigger and bigger. And solving it through divorce 5 years down the road, you're not going to be able to get away from it, most likely. You're going to have to kind of pay the cost of you ignoring it and not taking action on it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Bobby, thanks so much for another very insightful conversation. And we hope that you learned a lot about debt when it comes to getting divorced.
Thank you for listening to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast. We hope today's episode gave you clarity and support as you move forward on your journey. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Tune in next week for more insights and expert advice on the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast.